Welcome those who just joined us. I think we're going to get started. Peter said he'd like to get started close to on time. My name's Chris Taylor. I'm the new executive director here at the Museum of Boulder. 5 weeks, started, actually tomorrow's 1 month, I guess. I started on that 10th. So thank you all for coming out and for welcoming me to the community. Before Peter starts, just a few comments. As you can see on your chair, this is part of a full series for celebrating the centennial of Central Park, which you are also surrounded by a lot of information. Please come back. There's a lot to read. So come back and finish getting your history. There's a ton of partners. Please sneak a peek across the bottom, and there's a full list in the back, including the NAACP. Good Lord, name them all. They're right across the bottom there. Historic Boulder, the museum, the city. Yeah, they're all there. I want to also let you know that we're going to relaunch our series of Boulder Conversations with Extraordinary People this fall. So if you're into this kind of thing and hearing from great folks, and you probably, I see heads nodding, you've done it before. So come on back and starting this September. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And then this October 5th, our 80th anniversary is coming up, and we're going to be doing a fundraiser and an 80th celebration on October 5th. So please mark your calendars and save your dates for that. So I'm going to let Peter take it away here. This is the second time I had the honor to introduce Mr. Pollock. We did an event a few weeks back at Central Park, in Central Park at the band show. So briefly, from 2016 to 18, Peter managed Western programs for the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, where he worked on climate resilience. And for almost 25 years, he worked for the city of Boulder as a current and long-range planner and served the planning department from 1999 to 2006. He said he needs no introduction, so I'll stop there. Take it away, sir.
Thank you. All right, welcome everybody. Know many of the faces in the audience, so you can heckle me at any time during the proceedings here. I would welcome that. This is being recorded by KGNU, so I will be somewhat formal in terms of my narrative here, just so that it works for a radio audience as well. But thanks for joining me in making 100 years of Boulder, marking 100 years of Boulder Central Park by telling hundreds of years of stories. So the focus here is on storytelling. And I hope that the story I'm going to tell you will give you a better understanding of Boulder in the early 1900s and the role of the Boulder City Improvement Association and Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. in making plans for the improvement of Boulder, including the creation of Central Park. Over the course of more than 10 to 20 years, maybe, and some 8 presentations, I've focused on the Olmsted Plan and its creator, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. For a city planner like me, delving into this history has given me the chance to understand the work of a celebrated planning pioneer as it played out in the community I love. Increasingly, I've turned my attention to the people behind the plan, the improvers, the Boulder City Improvement Association, and the broader community that they represented. They called for the plan, supported it, and championed it, and to a great extent made it so. Tonight, I hope to give each of them, Olmsted Jr. and the improvers, equal weight. But first, let's acknowledge the people whose homelands were here well before the town name Boulder was even used. I acknowledge that my home in Boulder is on the ancestral homelands and unceded territory of the Apache, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, Kiowa, Pawnee, Shoshone, Sioux, and Ute. I honor and respect the people of these nations and their ancestors. The history I'm presenting starts less than 50 years after the founding of Boulder, when European settlers, in violation of the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, created the Boulder Town Company in 1859 for the purpose of selling lots. The forced removal of Indians, and worse, the murder of many, is a shameful part of Boulder's origin story. The development of Boulder took different forms over time. Each of these eras represent a change in the community's vision, an inflection point, if you will. From Native America to the frontier town in 1859, to the city beautiful in 1903, to the post-war boomtown in 1945, to the Boulder of today, which I think began to be shaped in around 1967. I am not qualified to describe or relate the Native Americans' traditional knowledge, but their life in Boulder contrasts strongly with the subsequent European settlers. They had a deep awareness of the seasons, the bounty and usefulness of plants and animals, and the opportunities and presence of water, shelter, and food that served their purposeful travels. Planning for Boulder as a frontier town was expressed in the original town plat that facilitated occupation and speculation, but also organized major functions like commerce, governance, housing, and travel in and out of town. Tonight, I'll focus on the City Beautiful era and the associated Olmsted plan. It represented a sharp departure from a town based on an economy of extraction, industry, and manufacturing to a university town. And I'll leave to some future presentation the course change after the end of World War II, when Boulder grew dramatically, as represented in S.R. DeBoer's 1948 city plan. And the reaction to that growth that took place in the 60s and 70s, represented in the 1977 Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan, which has led to the city of today, still seeking its balance between the environment, the economy, and equity. I've read that Boulder at its founding in 1859 had a population of 1,000. And the very next year, it was 174. That's because all the surface gold had been picked over and the miners headed to the hills. At the beginning of 1900, Boulder was a city of 6,150 people, and by 1910, the city had a population of 9,539. The town seemed fixated on hitting the 10,000 person mark, and claims to that effect were made in newspaper and promotional booklets before it happened. You can also see that all the way to World War II, there was some growth, but even in 1940, Boulder was still shy of 13,000 people. Just a little review on history here. Colorado Territory was formed in 1861, and Boulder County was one of the original 17 counties. Boulder was named the county seat and incorporated in 1871. The state of Colorado, the Centennial State, was formed in 1876. Importantly, Boulder was the first state to enact women's suffrage by popular referendum in 1893. Votes by women played a significant role in the direction Boulder took in areas like temperance, enforcement of laws concerning morality, and the betterment of parks and schools. Boulder has a history of taking a direct hand in encouraging development consistent with its vision by dedicating land, either privately by individual citizens, as is the case for the university, or by popular vote, as was the case for Boulder Chautauqua. The Hotel Boulderado was built through public subscription in order to provide a first-class hotel downtown. These are all projects that the Boulder improvers loved. In the early 1900s, most of the town seemed united over the question of growth, since both the commercial interests, the so-called boosters, and those interested in improvements, beautification, and various moral causes, the improvers, both wanted to grow. The question was, what kind of growth? The Boulder Commercial Association, founded in 1905, wanted to add more manufacturing to the mix, and in 1907 led a public subscription campaign to bring a sugar factory to Boulder, a campaign that ultimately failed. Those who didn't welcome an industrial presence were called knockers in the press. A writer to the Daily Camera said, "There are citizens who believe Boulder is large enough. They argue that her beauty, eligibility as a residence place, and conservative business welfare are to be conserved by keeping her down in size." Sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? Quoted in an article about an April 1909 booster banquet, Lieutenant Governor Harper noted that it didn't hurt his hometown, Akron, Ohio, to rub up against intelligent labor and admonish that Boulder must make up its mind. Do you want factories? Apparently, the answer was no, and the sugar factory proposal died. Other political currents were stirring as well. The forces of the temperance movement joined with the improvers and others to elect a new city council in 1907. They campaigned on the notion that the future of the university was at risk if Boulder had a reputation as a saloon town. The council ordered saloons closed and passed an ordinance forbidding the sale of liquor in the town or within 1 mile of city limits. 1907 is often pointed to as the official end of prostitution, gambling, and saloons in Boulder. With the passage of a local option law in the state legislature in 1907, Boulder citizens voted more than 2-1 in 1909 to officially make Boulder dry. This was reaffirmed in elections in 1911, 12, 14, 16, and 18. And even with the end of prohibition in the United States in 1933, the city of Boulder remained dry until 1967. In 1890, the Boulder Improvement Society was founded, but seems to have had limited success. However, in 1903, the improvers organized themselves under the banner of the Boulder City Improvement Association, the BCIA. Their purpose was to cooperate with all other organizations and individuals engaged in the work of bettering and beautifying the town. An April 15, 1903 Daily Camera article reports some 257 members. Organized before official boards or commissions for parks and planning were formed by the city, the leaders of the BCIA bet their reputations on bringing about their vision for the future of Boulder. What can we say about the leadership group as a whole? You see them listed there. First, they were all white, and except for Maud Gardner Odell, all men. They came from either the professional or owning class, not the working class. They were joiners of all sorts of groups throughout the community. They were the progressives of their day, and they were politically active. Many of them were involved one way or another in dealing with the disease tuberculosis. Half of them were associated with the university in some way. Now I'm going to give you some profiles of these leaders of the BCIA. And that forms part of the exhibit here in the room as well. Junius Henderson, the president of the BCIA, was a journalist, a lawyer, and a scientist. He moved to Boulder to be with his parents in 1892. His mother had moved here to seek a cure for TB. In May 1894, Henderson married his childhood sweetheart, Nellie, in Davenport, Iowa. They returned to Boulder the night before the 1894 flood. As a lawyer, he was a charter member of the Boulder County Bar Association, founded in 1907, and the elected county judge for the Republican Party for 7 years, from 1902 to 1909. In supporting his candidacy, the Longmont Ledger noted he is a temperance man, opposed to the drinking and the sale of liquor as a beverage, and that he stands high in Boulder circles as a lawyer, as genial and pleasant as a man. As a scientist and author, he wrote over 170 articles and books on geology, birds, mollusks, paleontology, and glaciers. He became curator of the University Natural History Collection in 1903, now known as the Henderson Museum. He earned a bachelor's degree from the university in 1906 and was named as professor of natural history until his retirement in 1933. He was the 6th recipient of the Norland Medal in 1935. In addition to his founding role with the BCIA, he served on the City Planning and Parks Commission from 1921 to 1926, during the time the Central Park was created. He died in 1937 and is buried in Green Mountain Cemetery. Here's a familiar name. Evan G. Fine, the vice president of the BCIA, was a pharmacist, business leader, conservationist, mountaineer, and ardent photographer. One of 12 children, Fine came from Missouri to Boulder in 1886 at age 21 to work as a pharmacist. A tireless promoter of Boulder, he was known as Mr. Boulder. He was secretary of the Boulder Commercial Association from 1905 to 1907, and during the period 1927 to 1936, he was secretary of the Commercial Association's successor organization, the Boulder Chamber of Commerce. After meeting him in 1908, Olmsted Jr. described him as a very active and enthusiastic improver. Fine was closely associated with the Colorado Chautauqua, and he served on their board for more than 50 years. He was a charter member and first president of the Rocky Mountain Climbers Club. He was on the executive committee of the 1909 semi-centennial. He served on the Planning and Parks Commission from 1918 to 1936, which also includes the period that Central Park was developed. He traveled extensively, lecturing and extolling the virtues of Boulder, sponsored by the railroad company. For 14 years, he would spend 2 months every year giving presentations using his glass lantern slides. And those are stored at the University of Colorado Archives. He presented to over 3,500 audiences and an estimated 500,000 people. Many early Boulder postcard images bear his name, along with his son, Hal Colson. He died in 1957 and is buried in Columbia Cemetery. Evan Fine Park at the western edge of Canyon in Arapahoe began as an auto park, a place for visitors to stop and camp. It was dedicated in 1959 to his memory. William Baird, the BCIA's secretary, was a physician, philanthropist, and promoter of city improvement and beautification. The Daily Camera called him the father of paving and the park system. We do not have a photo of Baird. Standing offer of $100 for anybody who can find it. So I just showed his handwriting, which was unfortunately for researchers like me was horrible. Luckily, Olmsted often had his letters transcribed by typewriter. He was born in Coal Fire, Alabama in 1861 and first arrived in Boulder in 1893. He taught at the university, maintained a private practice, and specialized in the care of tuberculars. As secretary of the BCIA, Dr. William J. Baird was the sole correspondent with Frederick Olmsted Jr. over a 24-year period. He held tenaciously to the recommendations of Olmsted, sometimes to the consternation of others in the community. In May 1907, he bought the land at the mouth of Gregory Canyon and dedicated it to the city in October 1908. That area was historically known as Baird Park. His personal life was turbulent. He divorced his first wife, Sally, in 1894 in Cheyenne County, Colorado. In 1906, he was expelled for adultery from the Boulder Baptist Church. He remarried the next year and had 3 children. He died in 1934 and is buried in Denver. Fred White, treasurer of the BCIA, was a businessman involved in mines, real estate, insurance, and loans. He was an ardent prohibitionist, running for state treasurer on the Prohibition ticket in 1892. He served on the Boulder City Council from 1907 to 1909, and again in 1913 to 1917. He was born in Glasgow, Scotland in 1860 and was the only family member to immigrate to the United States. He arrived in Colorado in 1880 to look after his family's interest in mines. On July 4th, 1882, he came down to Boulder from Salina to witness the laying of the original Boulder County Courthouse's cornerstone. He moved to Boulder in 1890 and took up his business dealings in real estate and insurance. Along with Albert A. Reed, he developed the Willard Building at Broadway and Spruce in 1898, named in honor of Frances Willard, the founder of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The building included meeting rooms for the Boulder chapter of the WCTU and a small reading room before the city had a library of its own. Us old-timers know it as the former location of the Aristocrat Steakhouse. The Boulder Daily Camera noted his service in moral and civic betterment issues. He died here in 1944 and is buried in Green Mountain Cemetery, of which he was a founder. I haven't found out much about Mr. Cousins, the chair of the Standing Committee on Streets, Alleys, and Sidewalks, nor a photo of him or his family, yet. Arthur Root Cousins was a dry goods merchant and banker in Wyoming and Colorado. He came west from England in 1883 at age 17. He married in Saratoga, Wyoming in 1891, and by 1906 he was in Boulder. The 1911 street directory lists him as a vice president of the Mercantile Bank and Trust Company and living at 2027 12th Street, now Broadway. That house is now known as the landmark Green Earl House. Later, he owned and operated the Cousins Store Company at 1320 Pearl Street until 1916. The 1920 census finds him in Sweetwater, Wyoming, and the 1930 census in Pueblo, Colorado. In the 1940s, he was in Laramie, Wyoming, and in 1945, Denver. Certainly got around. Cousins died in 1946 in Denver and is buried in Wheat Ridge. Just why he was chair of this particular committee, I'm not sure. In his Daily Camera obituary, Dr. Oscar Monroe Gilbert was called one of Colorado's most widely known physicians and one of Boulder's most prominent citizens. He was chair of the BCIA Standing Committee on Sanitation, Drainage, Sewerage, and Water. Born in 1873 in Fulton, Missouri, he graduated from Barnes Medical School in St. Louis in 1898. He was a member of the University of Colorado Medical School faculty from 1900 to 1932, when he retired professor emeritus. He traveled to London and Munich on a 2.5-month tour in a party organized by Dr. Charles Mayo in 1925. In 1943, he was granted honorary life membership in the Colorado Tuberculosis Association after serving on their board of directors from 1918 to 1935. He developed the physician's block at 14th and Spruce to provide better offices for doctors, and was a co-founder of the Mesa Vista Sanatorium in 1919 at 2121 Mesa Drive. As to his community work, in 1906, he was on the first board of directors of the Boulder Hotel Company, who developed the Hotel Boulderado, and he chaired the 1909 Boulder Semi-Centennial Celebration. He ran for mayor in 1909, but lost. Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. consulted on the Gilbert's home at 605 13th Street, one of just 2 residences Olmsted worked on in Boulder. He died in 1944 and is also buried in Green Mountain. Darwin Andrews was an internationally known landscape gardener, nurseryman, plant collector, and cultivator. Quite appropriately, he was chair of the Standing Committee on Tree Planting, Tree Culture, and Street Parking. The meaning of street parking here is not to park cars, but to create parks within the public right-of-way, such as tree planting strips and parkways. He was born in Farina, Illinois in 1869 and attended Milton College in Wisconsin, but was largely self-educated. He came to Boulder at age 24 in 1893. He went on native plant collecting trips in the mountains, initially with burros and on bicycle. He was the founder and operator of the Rockmount Nursery at 23rd and Bluebell in Boulder from approximately 1899 to 1937. He was noted for the collection, propagation, and sale of Colorado native plants. He collected plant specimens for the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago and provided plants to Harvard's Arnold Arboretum, among many other collections. Olmsted Jr. consulted with him to advise on questions of plant selection and propagation for his planting plans. Specifically for Central Park, Olmsted wrote to Baer that Andrews should make plant selections and advise on soil conditions. He received an honorary Master's of Science degree from CU in 1936 and died here in 1938. In 1948, Boulder High School's botany teacher, Maud Reed, undertook to develop an arboretum on the former right-of-way for the Denver and Interurban Railroad. Many of the plants were donated by the Rockmount Nursery, and at her request, it was named in Darwin Andrews' honor, the Andrews Arboretum. Maud Gardner Odell was chair of the Standing Committee on Education, Floral Culture, Schools, Window Gardening, and Playgrounds. That's a mouthful. The improvers met often at her house on Mapleton Hill, named Wester Hill, at 2237 6th Street. She was an advocate for the poor and sick, for good schools, and for parks. Born in Tennessee in 1869, she came west the next year at age 1.5 as part of a pioneer family to the Union Colony in Greeley. She came to Boulder to attend the university in 1889, and she graduated Phi Beta Kappa in 1893. In Olmsted's 1908 trip notes, he characterizes her as a widow, very active, efficient, intelligent, and cultivated. Her first husband, John Gardner, was a professor of biology at CU and died of TB. Her second husband, John Odell, a Chicago banker, lived for only a short time after their marriage. She was a charter member of the Boulder Parks Board in 1907, a founder of the Park Cemetery Association in 1910, elected to the school board in 1911, and president of the University Scientific Society in 1914. She died here in 1916, and her ashes were scattered on Flagstaff Mountain. As the sole woman member of the BCIA leadership, I've taken a particular interest in her story and offer you some more detail. Maud's arrival in Colorado was tied to the choices made by her parents, and in particular her father, J. Max Clark. He was born in Wisconsin around 1841, and he came to Colorado as a gold seeker in 1860, but returned east to fight in the Civil War. His memoirs recount his war experiences, including taking part in Sherman's march to Atlanta. After the war, he moved his family from Wisconsin into former Confederate territory in Fentress County, Tennessee, where Maud was born. Weary of the stresses of living in the reconstructed South, Clark answered Nathan Meeker's call in Horace Greeley's New York Tribune for people to join the Union colony and arrived there in the spring of 1870, and the family followed later that fall. There's a beautiful picture of Greeley, Colorado. So at age 1.5, Maud arrived at the Greeley train station with her mother and brother on November 1st, 1870. J. Max had been in court earlier that day, charged with arson in what came to be known as the Whiskey Riot. A tavern was burned to the ground, holding up the Union colony's deed restriction on the use of alcohol on colony land. Charges against Clark were later dropped. Maud Clark, here on the left, was therefore the daughter of a prominent colonist, perhaps a bit too prominent, but she enjoys the benefits of a tight, active community. She also enjoyed extensive family relations, including her paternal grandparents, 3 brothers of J. Max, an older brother Claude, and a younger sister Daisy. She enjoyed great success at school. At graduation from Greeley High in 1887, she read an essay based on Napoleon saying, "There shall be no Alps." Based on her school success, she had a strong desire to attend the State University in Colorado. Her father, J. Max Clark, did not lend his daughter any support to attend university, but Maud was determined to go. Tuition was free, but she needed to raise money for room and board. This she did by boarding and teaching in nearby Platteville. At the time Maud Clark entered university in 1889, there were 194 students enrolled, and for the first time, university students outnumbered students at the state prep school in Boulder. Maud pledged Delta Gamma the same year, and by her sophomore year, she was following a Bachelor of Sciences course. Enter John Gardner. He was born in Annan, Scotland in 1863, the son of a Presbyterian clergyman. He received a Bachelor of Science from the University of London in 1884. After university, he had postings as a Chief of Agriculture for the Bahamas in 1885, and to the British Association's table at the Naples Zoological Station in 1887. TB drove him to move to Colorado Springs in 1887, and in 1888, he came to Boulder as a state university instructor, then professor, and then chair of biology. He was also a professor of histology at the medical and dental schools and taught at the prep school. And you see where this is going. Maud and her professor fell in love. Her father, J. Max, objected to her marriage to a foreigner, since the Clarks were English and Gardner Scottish, and gave no financial assistance. John Gardner's rich and disagreeable uncle disowned him. Maud dropped out for the 1890-1891 school year to raise money by teaching in Greeley's 6th grade. In spite of these tailwinds, Maud and John were married at Maud's parents' home in Greeley, family only, August 4th, 1891. The couple honeymooned in Green Mountain Falls, Colorado. Upon their return to university, they were honored by a large reception, one of the most enjoyable affairs in the history of the university. 1894 was a big year for the Gardner family. Maud was one of only 10 undergraduates graduating that year. She was about 17 weeks pregnant at the time, hiding that fact from her parents and peers. John Gardner was granted a sabbatical starting June 1894 to September 1895. They barely made it out of town during the big flood of 1894. They toured Great Britain and then went to Naples, where John again had one of the American tables at the Naples Zoological Station. Dorothy Gardner was born there November 5th. For those familiar with University professor Mary Rippon's story, this represents a striking contrast. Rippon, an early and popular professor of languages, was expected to remain unmarried and had a child out of wedlock, a story captured in Sylvia Petham's Separate Lives. Whoopsie. Hope that doesn't persist. John Gardner's TB led to an early death, and his career at the university lasted only about 9 years. In October 1896, he requested to be relieved of part of his work, and Professor Romilly was hired as his substitute. By fall of 1897, he was preparing instructions to Maud upon his death, and in 1898, he resigned from the university. His Scottish uncle apparently had a change of heart and in 1899 willed a substantial sum to John. That was the year they built Westerville on Mapleton Hill. At the June 1900 university commencement, John Gardner was conferred the Doctor of Laws degree. He passed at age 37 on November 26, 1900, of what was then called consumption, and was buried at Columbia Cemetery. 10 years later, Maud surprised her parents, who were celebrating their own wedding anniversary in Greeley with a wedding of her own on New Year's 1910 to 62-year-old John J.P. Odell of Chicago. By the day after Christmas that same year, he was dead. John P. Odell had been a prominent Chicago banker, a director of the World's Columbia Exposition, who had dealings in land and minerals in Colorado. He had been previously widowed in 1907. Maud Gardner Odell had a keen intellect, great drive, and financial independence. She was a pioneer of women's new roles in society. She was a champion of education and a supporter of her beloved university. She died July 16, 1916, at age 47. Historian F.O. Replier called it a civic loss. She was cremated at Riverside Cemetery in Denver. She requested no funeral and no mourning. Her daughter, Dorothy, wrote that she spread her ashes on Flagstaff Mountain. So there, so much for our improvers and the leadership. And let's take a switch and a turn to the Olmsteds. Olmsted the Senior is known especially for his design of parks, estates, and college campuses, the founding of the profession of landscape architecture, and also his writing and journalism. But any Colorado work was likely done by Frederick Law Olmsted's son, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. And from a firm perspective, that means the Olmsted brothers, which also includes Senior's other son, John Charles. When the BCIA requested the services of the Olmsted brothers firm, they wrote that Boulder, a small but ambitious little town, wanted advice in the best obtainable as how to better improve our city as to parks, boulevards, and general plans for civic betterment. It was Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. who took on the project. Born July 24, 1870 on Staten Island, New York, Olmsted seemed destined to become the heir apparent to his father. For the first 4 years, he was named Henry Perkins Olmsted, but then renamed after his father. He became an accomplished landscape architect, city planner, and conservationist in his own right. At times, he dropped the junior from his name, as can be seen on the Boulder Plan of Improvements, and people came to wonder how anyone could have had such a long career. Olmsted Jr.'s Boulder work is one of several city planning projects he undertook in the early 1900s, including Detroit, Utica, Pittsburgh, New Haven, Rochester, and Newport. Biographers have pointed to Olmsted's frustration with his city planning work because of the long time frames called for to realize his suggested improvements, and often the lack of a professional to see them through. This was certainly the case for Boulder. Note also that the clients for his city plans were usually citizen associations or committees and not the official working of city government. This was also the case for Boulder. When people in Boulder talk about the Olmsted Plan, they're usually talking about two things. One is a report entitled The Improvement of Boulder, Colorado, Report to the City Improvement Association, dated November 9, 1908. And also a plan of improvements, a lithograph on a base map created by local cartographer Henry Drum, illustrating proposed parks, roads, widenings of roads, and parkways, also dated March 1910. 1,100 copies were printed by the Walker Lithograph and Publishing Company of Boston. As noted in his report to the BCIA, its purpose was to offer helpful suggestions drawn from experience and observation in many other cities and from a brief and limited, though eager study of Boulder, bearing upon one of the broad fundamental questions at the base of all municipal activities, namely what physical improvements within the reach of the city will help it to make it an increasingly convenient, agreeable, and generally satisfactory as a place in which to live and work. The writing in the report is dense and verbose, and probably to many with a Western ear, overly professional. The April 1910 Boulder Daily Camera opined, like most professional men, Professor Olmsted has evidently measured the value of his work by the prolixity of his report. Though it doubtless contains much of value, we shall refer to the report from time to time, if ever given time to read it. His primary role was to advise the BCIA on a plan of improvements that they would champion, but with an eye to changing the minds of other townsfolk as well, and his communication style may not have helped. Olmsted Jr.'s report covered a wide variety of topics, presumably reflecting the specific interests of the BCIA and townspeople in general. These included all things streets, waterways, including boulders, creeks, and ditches, and the issue of flooding, park locations, public buildings, sewage and signs, and public administration. Olmsted's focus was on improvements to be made within the public realm and not on private property. Zoning was not to come to Boulder until 1928 through the work of another planning consultant, Sacco Rink de Boer. As to the plan graphic, it shows the following. First, multiple road connections to the larger region. Second, the proposed location of Newlands Park and Martinez Park, which were ultimately developed, in a park on what was then known as Lover's Hill, which was not. Third, the western boundary of the city is shown in solid green as a city park. This is the precursor to Boulder's present open space and mountain park. Some of the mountain park had already been dedicated to the city by the federal government, but much remained to be acquired. And finally, the broad east-west green swath drawn along Boulder Creek shows the intent of developing both formal parks and also leaving land in a natural state along the whole of Boulder Creek as it flows through the city for park and flood protection purposes. So how is the plan to be implemented? Olmsted Jr. made recommendations for acquisitions that the city could make from tax proceeds raised through a dedicated property tax for park acquisitions and a park and street dedication requirement for new annexations. In order to secure the support of the landowners and developers, he made the argument that such dedications were not a socialistic project, but that they would improve the value of their property beyond any losses of land area. Beyond the 1910 plan of improvements, there were many Boulder projects that the Olmsted brothers worked on. In addition to relatively minor engagements on 2 residences, they provided significant input on street design and paving, the design of Broadway Bridge and associated waterworks, planting plans for 2 public schools, a boundary study for Newlands Park, and engineering studies for drainage and sewerage at a time when Boulder's public works were primitive and in great need of improvement. This work represents the contribution of other partners like Metcalf and Eddy of Boston and staff behind the scenes back in Brookline, but always with Frederick Law Olmsted Jr.'s oversight. So let's look specifically at the plans that are in the area of Central Park. This planting plan followed on the heels of the 1914 Metcalf and Eddy design for the ditch diversion at the southwest corner of what would become Central Park. The 12th Street, now Broadway crossing of Boulder Creek, has long been important. Historian Phyllis Smith wrote that by 1973, one could cross the creek at 9th, 12th, now Broadway, and 17th Street. The 1894 flood knocked out all these bridges, plus one at 6th Street. They were largely rebuilt by the next year. The former steel truss bridge on Broadway was replaced in 1921 based on an Olmsted design. The current bridge was built in 2003. and awarded a 2004 Award of Merit for sympathetic design from historic Boulder. Olmsted Jr. is perhaps best remembered locally as the inspiration for the treatment of land along Boulder Creek. In 1923, Olmsted created a unified plan for civic improvements along a stretch of Boulder Creek from 9th to 17th. This larger plan envisioned a memorial to those who served in and those who lost their lives in World War I. It shows the location for City Hall, an athletic field, and a park and pathway improvements. While in 1919, $100,000 bond issue passed for war memorial and park improvements, it was invalidated by the Colorado Supreme Court and a new election scheduled for November 1923. Regrettably, that bond issue failed. This lack of funding led to the development of a much smaller park in the area bounded by present-day Broadway, Canyon, 13th, and Arapahoe, known as Central Park. The land had been owned by the railroad and was leased by the city in 1921 and then acquired in 1933. Olmsted's design shows shrubs and trees along its perimeter and a greensward created in the interior with heavy plantings on the 13th Street side, maintaining the important views to the west. In 1929, the park had the characteristic starkness of newly minted parks. Today, Central Park has become one of the most valuable pieces of green space in Boulder because of its proximity to the downtown, its location along Boulder Creek, its role as a connector between the downtown and the university, and as a prime location of public events and gatherings. Is the Olmsted Plan part of Boulder's diversity problem? Boulder adopted its first racial equity plan in 2021. The plan includes a racial history of the city of Boulder. It points to a history of deliberate discrimination against Indigenous people and immigrant people of color, including Asian railroad workers, African Americans, and Mexicans. The history states that the height limit, the green belt that limited outward expansion of housing, and the fact that a significant portion of the city is zoned exclusively for single-family development all directly contribute to the high cost of housing in Boulder. Connecting the dots, they point out that the high housing costs continue to impact who can afford to live in Boulder, thereby decreasing diversity. The 1910 Olmsted Plan explicitly calls for a city of fine homes, and Boulder's 1928 zoning reflects that. Housing affordability is an acute problem for Boulder today, with the pressures of a growing university, a surplus of jobs for resident workers, and the overall attractiveness of the community. The documentary, this is, in brackets, not who we are, tackles the issue of discrimination against Black people in particular, and points to the Olmsted Plan as having set exclusivity in motion, as well as displacing both Black and white poor people from Boulder Creek in favor of Olmsted's plan to improve it. I'm looking forward to hearing Claire Brandt's presentation on the history of what is referred to today as the Water Street neighborhood. See some of the display up here. And looking at the 1910 Olmsted Plan document and the plan itself, when it came to the alignment of the proposed Boulder Creek Park, he recommended leaving that row of lots facing Water Street. That was 1910. But by the time of the 1923 preliminary plan of proposed park improvements along Boulder Creek, Olmsted Jr. shows a continuous park in the area from 9th to 12th from Water Street to Boulder Creek. Clearance of most of the buildings in the Water Street neighborhood occurred in 1919, and in 1921, it was reported that the city purchased all the land, except 3 lots lying between 9th and 11th, the railroad tracks in Boulder Creek. And even after the failure of the bonds for the Boulder Creek plan, it was reported in 1928 that the city had purchased the remaining 2 frame houses between 10th and 11th. Before the bond election in 1923, and what you're looking at here in the sort of poor reproduction, the Olmsted brothers calculated the potential cost to acquire the land for the Boulder Creek Park. 112 lots were targeted in addition to those already owned by the city or the railroad. 70 were vacant, but 42 had improvements. The total value of improvements was about $21,800, or about $370,000 in today's money. We've been reminded in Elizabeth Hope Cushing's biography of Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. of his own racism. as exhibited in his advice to developers on the use of restrictive covenants to exclude non-Caucasians in master planned communities, including 2 communities within which he resided. A recent study of the Olmsted brothers' use of race restrictive covenants in a sample of 12 of their master plan communities from 1900 to 1930 by Annie Schwentag, using the records of the Olmsted archives, shows just how extensive this practice was. But one thing that we have hopefully learned through all of the recent discussion on race and equity is the systemic nature of racism. It is hard to separate the worthy ends sought by the Boulder City Improvement Association from their built-in notions of just who should be the proper beneficiaries of those improvements. So with their advisor, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. Did the Olmsted Plan exclude working people from Boulder's vision of a university town? Olmsted starts off his 1910 report with a section entitled, "The Net Practical Result to be Aimed at." In planning practice today, this is akin to a vision statement, a declaration of what it is we wish our community to become. Restating his words, his proposed vision of Boulder was to, 1, create a perfect city of homes. 2, meet the needs of those people. 3, continue to serve as a local distributing center to a tributary area of farming and mining. 4, permit only manufacturing without noise, dirt, disorder, and annoyance. 5, allow manufacturing required to meet the needs of a city of homes. And 6, to provide for suburban farming at the edge of the city. It generally excludes manufacturing and industry as a prime use of land, and in this he was in sync with his clients, the improvers. They wanted growth, but not industrial growth, wishing instead to grow the university enterprise and associated institutions like Chautauqua. For Black workers, however, this transition meant fewer job opportunities. Historian Dan Corson, who's with us tonight, notes that for the period 1870 to 1950, while the Black population reached a high population mark of 166 in 1910, the jobs that they held were in decline, especially in railroads, hotels, and the decision to not expand the industrial base. Corson writes that this shift to being an important educational center meant that there was less tolerance for the working man, Black or white. Olmsted endorsed linking the growth of Boulder to the growth of the university, noting that the presence of the state university means that Boulder will always have a large body of students, of teachers, and of scholarly people not directly engaged in teaching, all occupied with intellectual pursuits and supported, like most of those who will seek Boulder for health or pleasure, wholly or largely by funds accumulated elsewhere or by others. So what are the racial attitudes of the improvers themselves? These are not easily discernible since most histories focus on a person's life path and achievements, leaving out the bad stuff. Much more work can and should be done on the improvers' political, social, and religious lives and looking at their personal thoughts as expressed in letters and diaries. In the course of my research, I've come across materials establishing a link between 2 of the BCIA leaders and eugenics. Sir Francis Galton was a British polymath, known as a proponent of social Darwinism, and in fact was Darwin's cousin. He was the originator of the term eugenics and the concept of nature versus nurture. I'm no expert on this topic, so here's a description from the online Colorado Encyclopedia, which is sponsored by History Colorado. Eugenics rose to prominence in the Progressive Era, when reformers of all kinds envisioned a utopian society free from poverty and disease. Progressive legislative efforts to improve public health in the face of rapid industrialization propelled eugenic ideas into mainstream society, and eugenic ideology persisted well past the 1920s. However, not all progressives believed in eugenics. Influenced by social Darwinism, the misapplication of Darwin's natural selection theory to human society, eugenicists argued that problems within society stem from biological inheritance. In this view, charity needlessly kept the poor, therefore weakest members of society alive against natural law. As a result, the eugenics movement composed largely of white elites, privileged existing social hierarchies that benefited populations of native-born people who were also wealthy Protestant descendants of Northern Europeans. And so back to the Gardner family, John, Maud, and Dorothy. In Dorothy Gardner's papers in the CU archives is a first-person narrative titled Fingerprint Baby. She recalls that her mother took her fingerprints at age 12 hours and subsequently twice a year until the age of about 10 and sent them to Sir Francis Galton. These prints were in service of a project of Galton to try and discern if fingerprints could help determine one's race and inherited qualities. Dorothy Gardner posed the questions he was researching as, were fingerprint patterns inherited? Did they run in families? Did different races have similar fingerprints, like similarities in color, hair, facial characteristics, etc.? Her father, John Gardner, she wrote, had worked with Charles Darwin and Thomas Huxley and corresponded with Francis Galton while in Britain. Before the Gardner family went to Italy in 1894, they had consulted Galton on Naples' suitability as a place for having a baby, and he urged them to take fingerprints of their child since he did not have a good set of prints of a child from birth to puberty. Dorothy wrote that Maud fingerprinted her own family and those of her friends and obtained prints of American Indians. As she clarifies later in her story, fingerprints are individual personal possessions with no familial or racial similarities. They do not change. They are not inherited. Dorothy Gardner donated a series of letters from Sir Francis Galton to her mother from 1894 to 1907, and these are contained in the CU archives. Paraphrasing an article from the March 20, 1923 Boulder Daily Camera, it announces that a society for the study of eugenics and dissemination of information on the subject is being organized by a Wyoming newspaper editor, Mrs. Laura Mann. What stands out is the purported list of those who have endorsed the so-called movement. Listed are Gardner's successor professors of biology at the university, Francis Romilly and TDA Cockrell, and also CU's president, George Norrell. Also listed are the mayor, J.O. Billig, president of the Women's Club, Mrs. S.E. Goldsworthy, and superintendent of schools, W.V. Casey. And one improver shows up on the list, our faithful correspondent with Frederick Olmsted Jr., Dr. William J. Baird. Clearly, there is more to learn about the influence that eugenics had in a whole variety of Boulder institutions, including its planning and development. So like all good stories, this one has heroes and villains, good and bad, both often contained within a single person. And I suspect that when historians write about our time, it will have a similar feel. There are hopefully an infinite number of new stories yet to be written, and we all have a chance to help create them. Central Park itself has a storied history of revisions and additions and subtractions, but for me, I'd be happy with its original design. A park that even now still provides a sense of beauty, serenity, and nature within the heart of our city. Happy 100th birthday, Central Park, and thank you. So with that, objections, clarifications, corrections, stories of your own. Yes, sir.
Yes, what is the road
The
to
width,
go through the park? Is that?
that is just a path. That is a
Oh, that's the
pathway.
path. Okay.
Many of their designs were, for strolling in a park, right? And to enjoy just the view and nature away from the hustle and bustle of the city. So I imagine that is what we would think of as a crusher fine compacted path through the heart of the path, through the heart of the park. Yeah. Molly, did you have?
Yeah, I thought that part of the plan was to put a road along the mount, right along the ridge of the mountain. Is that part of the Olmsted plan, Peter?
Yes, there are several parkways that are shown, and even some platting that took place. There was to be a Riverside Drive. I think part of the context to get, at this time, they actually did a traffic count of the traffic at Broadway, and Canyon, Water Street. And I think the total for the day was like 100 cars. And so these were meant as the kind of, pathways or roadways that you might have seen in like, Arcadia Park in Maine or something like that. These were carriage drives, those kinds of things. So Riverside Drive, though it still shows up on some city plats and for improvements, was never really developed. Dan,
Was there, do you know whether there was any communication between Olmsted and Sacramento Board about Boulder?
not that I've discovered. I know that Leonard is going to be giving a talk about the subsequent improvements to Central Park. And may have more to say on that topic, but the board really sort of followed on the heels of Olmsted's time in Colorado. And by that time, Olmsted had established an office in California, in Palos Verdes, and was working hard on that project.
When did the conversation, the letters between Baird and Olmsted begin?
So I think I mentioned it was.
Sorry to push on this,
No,
but
it's okay.
because the zoning ordinance was in 1928.
Right. Now, the BCIA did ask for advice about zoning. And that was something that was sort of brand new at the time. And as I mentioned, Olmsted really thought of his plan as something that would dealt with public realm. These were improvements that took place in the public right of way. It was about parks, all that kind of stuff. Really didn't talk much about the idea of placement of buildings and setbacks and heights, all the fun stuff that we think of today associated with zoning. But I think the Hoover Commission on Zoning took place like in the late 20s, early 30s, about that era. So there was a whole shift in thinking within the city planning community in favor of also regulating the use of private land. And Olmsted was asked about this and sent materials to the BCIA. But I don't know that DeBoer and Olmsted ever directly interacted on the topic. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I'm very curious about the relationship between the city government, elected officials, and this group of improvers. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Right. There's something called social network analysis, which is you start to look at the relationships between different people over time, which is something I'd like to apply to this puzzle, if you will, and to look at who these people were involved with, both politically and in other ways. But I think the way to look at this is that the BCIA was just before the city started its process of developing boards and commissions for parks and planning. As I think I mentioned, Ms. Mott Gardner Odell was she was on the Parks Board in 1907. And two of the members were on the Planning and Parks Commission, which was the successor organization after that during the time of the development of Central Park. So, you could sort of think of this as sort of a Plan Boulder County kind of organization where members of that organization then started to populate the various boards and commissions formed by the city organization itself. So Fine and Gilbert and other people were very involved locally and politically. There's a whole political history that goes with this that results in the first charter to form the city, that type of thing. And many of these people had multiple interests and were involved in those kinds of efforts as well. Yes.
So that drive by individual residents is just a theme that speaks to me in Boulder's history. How unique do you think it is nationwide, or do you even feel like you could speak to that? To have, there's so many instances of Boulder residents choosing to tax themselves, especially for beautification type reasons.
So I think looking at that list, for instance, of Olmsted's city plans that he worked on. A lot of those communities had associations, a lot of them led by business people who thought that this was a way to go to further their economic future. Some of them related to sort of an idealistic view of what progressive policies and city beautification could mean to social issues as well. But I think this is largely a club of larger cities and college towns. And it's probably where you're going to see most of that activity occurring. There were national associations of people who were involved in city improvement and those kinds of efforts. And Boulder had membership in most of those organizations. Yes, go ahead.
This might be a simple question. I don't get what a public subscription is. What is that exactly?
Public subscription is people coming forward and, so I, with my friends, formed the Boulder Hotel Company for the purpose of building the Boulder Auto, what comes to be known as the Boulder Auto. And I go knock on doors and say, gee, would you put $1,000 into this? And so it's probably a very early form of real estate finance. And how they were ultimately paid back for those subscriptions, I don't know. Or whether they were considered largely donations. The ones that I'm familiar with are the Boulder Auto, which was successful, obviously. And the sugar factory, where they kept on trying to get those last dollars in and didn't quite get to the finish line. But by subscription was one way they could do the building of these projects.
So that's like an early form of crowdsourcing?
Churches use subscriptions a lot
Did they?
to
Yeah.
raise funds to build sanctuaries and whatnot, you know.
But those were,
So no payback.
right, those would be
It's a lot
considered,
of the donation, but it raised your standing within your organization. If you will.
these lists of subscriptions and who was donating how much money would be published in the paper. So it was a way to raise your profile in the community and say, yeah, I gave $500 to the Boulder Auto. But whether they got paid back or not, I do not know. So, yeah. Yes,
At any time around 1900, were other cities in Colorado having the same dilemma or same concept? Fort Collins, really, they have organizations like this, or is Boulder unique in that?
Boulder is probably unique in terms of the size of community and the extent to which it was involved in this movement. Olmsted Brothers did projects in two other settings, primarily in Colorado. One was for Colorado College. So a lot of work was done for Colorado College by the Olmsted Brothers. And Olmsted was also in their pitching on various iterations of the Denver Civic Center and different works that were going on through the work of Mayor Spear at the time. That's a place where we see DeBoer get much more active, was in the Denver work for sure. Okay, other comments, questions? Emily?
You had George Norland on your list of eugenics supporters, right? That was a big shock, and he's so often, noted as that that anti-KKK advocate. That's my comment.
Yeah, it's perplexing, and that article is a relatively new addition to research. The interaction between the Gardners and Sir Francis Galton, have been aware of a longer period of time. And that sort of tracks with what there's, you can Google TDA Cockrell and CU and eugenics, and you'll uncover some work that students are doing up there actually to connect some of the early biology professors, which fits with Gardner. So Gardner was first professor of biology, who was named the chair. The building wasn't named after him. Romilly got the name of the building, and Cockrell was a successor to that. All those people were teaching things like heredity. And so we're involved in that movement. Norland was a surprise, and the mayor, and Women's Club, and the superintendent of schools. And I use the word carefully to say purportedly. Because I wasn't sure if the lead of the story is a newspaper editor from Wyoming who's here for the winter, has started this group up and has some principles that they are all signing on to, saying that people should know more about eugenics. And there is George Norland's name associated with it. So this bears much more research and looking into it. But in the spirit of, I think a lot of the lightning rod for the plan that came out in that era was Olmsted himself, in looking at his racial attitudes. And my perspective has always been, Olmsted was the hired gun. They hired him for a reason, because he, endorsed their views and wanted to prepare a plan for our community that embodied those, for sure. But he was following the work of the Improvement Association itself. And so that begs the question, what are their attitudes? And so felt that it was time to sort of bring that forward. Nancy?
Is there anything in the document, the obesity document that talks to race and exclusion of minorities?
Simple answer is no. So this is a reprint of The Improvement of Boulder, Colorado, which I've had the pleasure of, maybe the only person who's read it more than 3 times, but anyway. Maybe. Probably. We'll bet on it. And the simple answer is no. He does not mention race. The only time he talks about gypsies living on Boulder Creek. But that appears from looking at an oral history in Carnegie to have been a fact, that there were gypsies who lived along Boulder Creek. And he talked about sort of an undesirable class of occupants on the creek, which could simply be code words that would be understood by others to refer to people of color or whatever. So he never explicitly uses racial terms per se, but I think the attitude of we're doing this partly to clean up a part of city that has undesirables, I think fairly is in the report.
Is the park itself displaced? I read the little bio there about her presentation. It talks about how the park itself displaced a number of people of color or minorities.
Right. So you'll see, and this is work that Claire's provided to educate us more on this whole issue. The Water Street neighborhood was predominantly between 10th and 11th Street, just south of Water Street. So not on Central Parkland itself, but part of the overall park plan from 9th to 17th. And by the time Olmsted got back to it in 1923, the city had already decided to purchase all those pieces of land. And these people were therefore displaced from, and then the bigger park plan was not built. Central Park itself, as I understand it, buildings on it, and a greenhouse and other, buildings, they were also displaced. And I've been trying to think of something that we could relate to in our contemporary lives to that whole process. Because it's certainly not unheard of for cities to displace residents or buildings. And certainly I think of the donut shop at Crossroads Shopping Center and Dr. Tracy's veterinary clinic that was moved out of there to build a shopping center that the city decided was going to be its future. So these are tools that were certainly used then, but we should also note that they have been used in our contemporary times as well. Yes, please.
Just a comment, in New York, Olmsted, established in New York Central Park, they displaced the Irish who were considered undesirable during the Civil War.
Yes.
They were building that Central Park, so they were.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Yes.
Can you suggest the number of times that Olmsted actually visited Boulder?
Right. I think it amounts to 2. So I think this is a contemporary problem in environmental design as well. I will say that. I watched my wife, who's a landscape architect, do her work looking through Google Maps and those kinds of things at sites that she has to work on. The client doesn't seem to be willing to pay for anybody to travel there. So first of all, imagine the logistical issues of that. The offices were in Brookline and then later in California, and here we sit in the middle of the country. So this involved substantial, train trips to make these trips to see Boulder. He notably came in 1908 and met all the improvers then, and that led to the development of the initial plan, written document, and lithograph of the improvements. And I take from that, he just traipsed around the whole city and looked at every piece of our topography, basically. He was trying to get a sense of the land. And I think that led to a lot of the kinds of suggestions that were made for some of the roadways that Molly mentioned, that type of thing. You only come up with an idea like we should make Lover's Hill a park if you've been up on the bluff and seen the sunset or something like that. I find that, his sensibilities of being able to read the landscape were remarkable. And that the plan in terms of looking at our original geomorphology, the creek and laundries over centuries and centuries, the creation of these bluffs and how they could be used in a design were very significant and are reflected in the plan. A lot of the other stuff was very sort of practical in orientation. Things like, gee, you're not thinking about where this roadway needs to go. We almost lost a connection with Broadway down past Baseline because the subdivider didn't include the right of way for the road to go through. And so having created a plan in advance, the city was on top of the issue of, oh, we actually might need to think about a roadway that would go south to Golden. So a lot of them were practical things about, what kind of paving material to use, work with engineers, those kinds of things. But the sense I get from the overall picture of protecting the creek, protecting the bluffs, parking the city, meaning putting parks into the city, that was to me the most remarkable aspect of it. Yes.
You did either the improvers or Olmsted have anything, have engagement in the Boulder's water supply, the street?
Well, some of them in ways that were not reflected necessarily in this kind of history, but certainly the securing of the Arapahoe Glacier as a water supply, dealing with the flooding issues from Sunshine Creek and Boulder Creek. Those were all there. The work that Metcalf and Eddy went on to deal with sewerage. We were dumping everything into the creek when Olmsted got here in 1908. So part of their work was to develop sort of the initial pieces of water treatment for sewage and those kinds of things. Most of the city didn't have paved streets at the time. So you have to think of it as coming from very much of a frontier town into what we would think had sort of the beginnings of the underpinnings of a real town. Yes.
In listening to this, it seems this probably is built on my own lack of information, but it seems as if this is still a period with more aura than scholarship. It would highlight Emily hearing that Northern is evolving the genders. It's really a shocking revolution. So is there not much you've obviously done a lot to set us together, because there's not much, I'm surprised that our lack of scholarship and putting some of these things down in this really important area, which is still more legends than that. And given all the controversy that comes up in Boulder, you think somebody picked up on this earlier, but somebody's really quite shocking.
I agree. And I don't think, there has been sufficient focus on it, and that's why I suggested that. Again, flipping the table, there's a fair bit known about Frederick Olmsted Jr. I mean, there's a biography written, there's a whole archives back in Brookline, Massachusetts. We know a lot about their work, but how their work was taken and used by Boulderites is a little shocking. Most of the history that's been written for Boulder is flying pretty much at well above the treetop level, and sort of who did what when kind of stories. And I think that there hasn't been a lot of scholarship about some of the in-depth stuff. Now, I will say, something like Sylvia Petham's book on Mary Rapon. This is the kind of work I think needs to be done about these kinds of people. Much more in-depth, that type of thing. Maud Clark Gardner Odell has her diaries at the university archives. They are pretty hard to read, but could be read. And so I think there's much more that could be done, absolutely. So I would totally endorse that. Would love to get personally involved in it, but I think another generation needs to take this on.